So okay, we kind of touched on the emitter portion of it. Then you got to get it to the storage site, right? So that's the whole other game changer that we're seeing as well. I mean, some people have been in the game, as you pointed out earlier. Others are trying to figure out,
Yeah.
now I've got land capture. Maybe I have a deal struck with an emitter. Now what? And
Yeah,
so that,
exactly. And it really, and that is going to be just a huge issue going forward. Transportation is a key piece of it. There's two ways that people are approaching it, and both of them have their pros and cons. One is just repurposing existing natural gas lines. So, or really, it could be any kind of line that's out there. And so they say, well, we're going to just make sure it has the integrity to be able to handle CO2. We're going to make sure we don't put any water in there because water and CO2 cause acid, and that's never good, right? But so then to say instead of doing natural gas, we're going to transport CO2. Now, here's the thing that's interesting from a land perspective. You know, a lot of these pipelines have been there, I don't know, 40, 50 years, some of them. And they had a right of way that was drawn up between the transporter and the landowner. And that right of way, if they're older right of ways, tend to be, and Brent, this is where you guys need to weigh in because you know way more about this than I do. But from an operator standpoint, we've seen that we have right of ways that give general latitude to be able to transport anything, but some of the newer ones and maybe more sophisticated owners, when they did those right of ways, said, no, it's only natural gas that you can transport. So even when you repurpose a line, the owner of that line is going to have to go back and go, wait a minute, do I actually have the right to transport CO2 across this particular landowner's piece of property? And so that's a really interesting dynamic that's happening out there right now. Of course, the other thing is you can just build new pipelines, right? Well, of course, that's a huge undertaking to get all the right of way that's required for that. To build it takes a long time, and then the permitting side can be a bear, as well as dealing with local stakeholders. I mean, you have local communities that really have some concerns and they want to know what's going on. They want to have their voice be heard. They want to make sure that their communities are being protected, and all that's great. As usual, the oil industry is not great with engaging with communities, though a lot of them are realizing in this case, if we're going to build a new pipeline that's going to be transporting it, we need to do a great job of engaging with our communities and making sure they understand what this is. And so both approaches really kind of have their pros and cons, but it's never easy. But that is a huge piece of it. And if you can't link up the emitter to the storage side, it doesn't do any good. You really have to have all three at the same
well,
time.
that's really evidenced by the locations that we tend to do these types of projects in. They're all very close to emitter. The land grab over the last 12 to 18 months has been insane. Everybody's along their
Yeah,
place, right? They're trying to get enough acreage secured to be able to build these projects, and they don't want to have
right,
to be held captive by the viper, or they don't want to build
right,
200 miles worth of pipeline or 50 miles worth of pipeline. So
right.
the right of way, kind of the greenfield right of way work that we're seeing is short, right? It's maybe we've secured enough rights with a large landowner and we're filling that in with smaller owners, but they don't want to build any more than 10, 15, 20, 30 miles worth of pipe at the most. And it's offsetting.
Yeah,
And to kind of go back to your point about how complicated some of these right of way agreements are, that we see differences geographically. The concerns of a South Texas cattle rancher, and maybe the sophistication of a South Texas cattle rancher around Corpus Christi is going to be different than someone who really hasn't dealt with a lot of pipeline, in the upper Midwest around an ethanol facility.
for sure.
And so,
Yeah,
you see different considerations, whereas in South Texas, you've got some CO2 pipe out there, and then you can
yeah,
potentially strike a deal. You may have to tie into that pipe. So then you're going to cross a big ranch, and those are business partners more than they are someone giving you a right of way. I mean, they're very sophisticated.
absolutely.
But you get up in other parts of the world, of the country, and right of way is a new thing. Some oil and gas companies showing up, talking about carbon sequestration. That's a
Hmm.
foreign subject. It's a foreign language to start with, and then you throw political winds into it, and it's a challenging challenging thing to get past. And I think that's been the biggest challenge for both these storage companies who are trying to put these projects together and the land people that that are trying to help and doing and working for
Yeah.
the storage company. And um, but it's with all things, it sounds easy until you really get into it.
Yeah.
It's,
That's exactly right. I mean, people, yeah, I've seen that myself, is where, people fly at 30,000 feet and they talk about how great CCS is, and it is. But then you get into the weeds and you're like, oh my goodness, this is way more complicated than I really hoped for. But I think one trend we're going to see is I do think you alluded to this earlier, is that I think you're going to see more storage sites located closer to the emitters. Just the idea that even if it's within a state, just the idea that you want to put together a pipeline that is, this massive undertaking, and especially if it spans multiple states and you get the federal government involved, I just think a lot of people are going to be like, you know what, that's just not worth it. We need to find almost co-located storage sites with the emitters, or at least very close. Just in fact, the Bloomberg had an article a couple weeks ago, just talking about this massive effort for, I think it was a Navigator pipeline to go across from like Illinois up into North Dakota. Now, North Dakota has some storage sites that are great, and that's why they want to do it. The same thing in Wyoming as well. Those sites have been permitted, and so you're like, oh, great, we've got a storage site to put it. But just the monumental effort that it takes to do those types of projects, I think they're going to be a big turnoff. And so the trend I think we're going to see on the transportation side is probably what you're seeing, Brent. It's just shorter runs of the pipelines and looking for more localized solutions, which in a lot of ways is probably a better outcome anyway. People always get skittish about, wait a minute, why are you sending something from a whole different state that doesn't involve me, may benefit them, but you just want to come across my property? What benefit is that to me? I don't really. Some people have a hard time resonating with that plan. So I think the more localized solution is probably where it's going, if I had to guess.
yeah, for sure. Or depending on your economics, if you already have that infrastructure in place to transport CO2, then it opens up the world for you, right?
Yeah,
And that's what we're starting to see some of the Kinders and groups like that put projects together and storage projects together in random places,
yeah.
because they don't,
Look,
the acreage capture is cheaper. They can identify one landowner along thousands of miles of pipe, that allow them to build a project. And so everybody's got their play, right?
Yeah, yeah. Having that legacy CO2 pipeline is a huge deal. Having infrastructure that can be repurposed is huge. I mean, look at Exxon. They bought Denbury, and I just was talking to an executive at Exxon just on Friday, and it was like, yeah, we bought it for their green pipeline. I mean, that was it. That was the reason they bought it, was because they had this massive CO2 pipeline in place, operational. And they didn't buy it for all the oil and gas fields. They bought it for that. And that's just such a huge advantage, to be able to run off of that line and be able to, just, you can find some spots, but that infrastructure is just so important.
It is, and Dudley does some work with Denbury up in the Rockies, and it's been great and interesting to learn as I talk to those guys and learn more about their business and what they do. I had no idea. I mean, those guys were active with storage projects from day one because they knew the value of their
Right.
pipe. And whole team, the guys on that side of their business have been just blowing and going and building, tie-ins to their storage projects, and it was just like a big old beautiful piece of candy for a company like Exxon.
Yeah, absolutely. It really jumpstarts them, and it was valuable, and they paid for it. So yeah,
that's their model. It makes sense for them.
Yeah, for
sure.
sure.
Build it when we can buy it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
What's your?
Oh, you couldn't replicate that line now. I mean, that's the thing. You cannot replicate something like that. Or
without eminent domain. I mean, it's just nearly impossible to build any kind of pipeline without eminent domain. I mean, it's just more and more people are cognizant of, their rights, and they've got the environmentalists behind them and things like that. And to your point, hey, I'm a landowner. Land is not cheap anymore. Why would I want a pipeline ran across it? and perceptions are what they are. Um, it's a challenge. I mean, buying right away nowadays is tough for any kind of thing, whether it's gathering. Hell, I was talking to the clients of ours in North Louisiana in the Haynesville oil natural gas play, and there's a tremendous amount of pipe in the ground there. Just in the last 2 or 3 years, I mean, rates for pipeline right of way have gone through the roof, and that's just for a small 8 inch line.
Right.
So, I mean, imagine trying to put in 100 mile worth of CO2 pipe without any.
Yeah. No,
It's
it's a tough.
tough deal.
Yeah.